Hey guys, Gregory here. Recently I got a question under one of my videos which goes like this. How do you strum with a pick and not make it sound so horribly loud and reverberating? So that is going to be the topic of today's lesson. We're going to try to figure out what we're doing that creates that harsh quality, and of course what we can do to make everything sound way more pleasant. Of course, if you enjoy lessons like this, please like, share, and subscribe as it will help me to grow the channel. Let's get to the lesson. So we need to first understand what gives us that harsh quality in our strumming. And really, it's just an imbalance in the volume, in the way that we strum. If we were to strum the guitar loudly, all the time, it will definitely just sound very rash. And we don't want that. So what we're going to learn is how to control the way that we strum. But the first point that we're going to take a look at really is not really about controlling the way that we strum. We're going to talk about the pick that you use. So picks come in different thicknesses. Thinner picks very naturally give you a lighter tone. So that's one of the first things you can take a look at. Just go down to the music store if there's one near you and try to get a thin pick. For me, a thin pick is anything maybe under 0.6 of millimeter, 0.6 millimeters. That will really give you a light tone. So those picks tend to flex a lot when you strum. So naturally, because of that flex, you get less resistance when you strum. So everything just naturally sounds very light. Of course, it is still possible to sound like you're strumming very harshly, even if you use a thin pick. But we're going to address those things in the other parts of this lesson. Of course, the opposite to that is to use a thick pick, and a thick pick will naturally give you a harsher tone, right? And that's because there's more resistance in there. So when you strum, that resistance is giving you more volume. But at the end of the day, having a thick pick or a thin pick is not the end reason why you should have a harsh tone or a very pleasant tone. It all comes down to technique. So let's move on to the next point. Here's the second thing to consider when trying to create a nice even tone in your strumming. This point has to do with the angle of the pick when you strum the guitar. Remember, as I mentioned before in my last point, the volume or the harshness in our tone really comes from the resistance of the pick hitting the strings, because more resistance naturally means more volume. So consider this. We have a pick and we have the strings. Let's just imagine my finger is the string, well, A string or these strings. Let's use 3 fingers. So these 3 fingers are the strings. And we have the pick. If we were to strum with the pick pointing, I suppose this might be considered a 90-degree angle, right? The pick is pointing straight towards the strings, and we were to strum straight down. This would actually give us a lot of resistance because the pick, which is very flat, is trying to break through the resistance of the strings, and we're going to get a louder tone way more naturally. All right, okay. So we could consider 2 other angles. If we're strumming down, what if we were to point the pick up, right? With the pick pointing up, it will naturally very much glide off the strings a lot easier. There's a lot less resistance for the pick to pass through the strings, and you're going to get the sound that you're looking for. So I think when we strum down, we really want to try to aim to have the pick pointing up. Okay, it's a very common sense thing. Once you become aware of it, you may not be aware of it, but once you do become aware of it, it's like, okay, that makes sense, right? So when strumming down, having the pick point up will give you a very balanced tone, and very much the opposite. When strumming up, having the pick point down will give us once more a very even, gentler tone. So let's put this to the test. I'm going to hold a G here, and I'm going to do the first example where I point the pick flat against the strings, and I'm just going to strum these strings, and let's see what that sounds like. It may not accurately come through the mic, but you can try it on your own. So the pick is pointing straight toward the strings, and I'm going to give it 1 strum. Right? Fairly loud. All right. Now I'm going to point the pick up and strum down once more. Alright, I can feel the difference there. I feel as if there's much less resistance, and the tone sounds a lot more rounded, a lot more pleasant compared to having the pick point straight toward the strings. Right? I can actually feel the pick hitting each individual string when I have it like this. Let's try it with the up strum. So with the up strum, I'm going to point the pick down and strum up. Right? It sounds pretty, pretty fine. If I were to point the pick straight here and strum up, yeah, it definitely sounds a lot louder naturally. So the angle of the pick when you strum really affects the tone that you get. Okay, but how do we practice doing this? Well, the most natural way to get in the habit of angling the pick in the right way is to think about strumming from the wrist, right? So when I say wrist, I mean we strum using this movement that we usually use to open door handles, all right? As opposed to strumming from the, let's say, the elbow or the forearm, which looks more like this. When we strum from this angle, the pick tends to stay in one angle. So if I have the pick like this and I use my forearm, it tends to stay at one angle. But if I turn my hand, if I strum from this, the pick naturally goes in the direction that I would want it to get less resistance when I strum, okay? Right? So what I mean is strumming from the wrist would look like this, and I would more easily get a very balanced tone. But if I strum exclusively from the forearm like this, the pick just tends to stay in one angle all the time. And it sounds a lot more harsh compared to using this movement here, which is what we call the wrist movement. Of course, strumming is really a combination of those two things most times. But this is really just a starting point for you. To get more information on strumming from the wrist, I have a video which I will link to, which I go a little bit more in depth about it. It is something that you would have to practice. You can see the results of it immediately by just taking your time to do it. But to really make it a part of your playing, to then feel satisfied, like, yeah, okay, I've kind of gotten it, and my strumming now sounds a lot more balanced, you would have to practice it and make it a part of your playing. So take a look at that video that I will link to, and it will really help you to get on your way to strumming more from the wrist. If you're looking to take these ideas a bit further, you really want to get control over your strumming hand, you want to sound expressive, interesting, or even exciting, I go through all of these things and more in a course that I came out with this year. You can find a link down to it below. It goes over rhythm, understanding the things that you hear, dynamics, techniques, anything to do with strumming. So find that down below, and thanks for watching so far. So the third point that I have for you to consider when trying to achieve a very balanced or gentle tone is how intensely do you move your hand when you strum. If you tend to swing your hand a lot when you strum, you're probably going to get a very loud and uncontrolled tone. So think about that. It's a really obvious point, I suppose, but it's something that you may have to think more about and to have it become a part of your playing. I would say there's some students that come in day one, they have a heavier hand, so everything that they strum just naturally sounds kind of harsh, and they have to think their way out of it because for some reason they just swing the arms more and they get louder volumes. Where on the opposite end, I have some students that come in and day one they have a lot softer tones without me having to say much. So you just may be the sort of person who just naturally swings very heavily. Just try to make it a part of your practice to hold back a bit. All right, and I guess the point in itself is fairly obvious, but it's something worth thinking about. All right, so here is the fourth point, and in my opinion, this is probably the biggest factor when it comes to controlling volume or creating harshness or gentleness in your playing. It has to do with how tightly you hold the pick. Most of the volume of your playing comes down to this one point. all right? A little bit of a squeeze can add a lot of volume to your playing. And it's something that I want you to spend some time playing around with. It works really well in conjunction with the other points. So say, for example, the point where I said to control the angle of the pick when strumming. Added to pick grip, those two things really help to shape the tone. But I really want you to spend a lot of time thinking about how tightly you hold the pick. All right, so getting a good tone on the guitar really comes from, in my opinion, being able to lightly grip the pick, but maintain the intensity of the strum. Okay, if I were to tell most of my students to strum lightly, if they were doing something like this, and I said, okay, strum softly, their strum may start to sound more like this. Now, I don't know if you can tell the difference, but what I did there is, and what they tend to do, is everything sort of slows down, so their strum starts to sound as if the pick is rolling off the strings. Okay, so the strum is no longer sounding like I'm hitting all the strings all at once, like that. It starts to sound more like this. That kind of correct sound, okay? And if you can have an intense or quick strumming movement with a very light grip, you'd realize you would sound way more interesting. That, the ability to do those two things at once, can really make your playing sound interesting. At least it's the very starting point to controlling the way that you sound so that you can add certain dynamics into your playing. So we have this. If I were to tighten the grip a little bit, it's a lot louder. I'm going to really squeeze the pick now. Right? A little bit of a squeeze and all of a sudden there's so much added volume. So what you need to play around with, what you need to practice, is practice holding the pick lightly. A lot of the more interesting strumming tones come from a very light grip. So spend a lot of time thinking about it. You can play around with it in the earlies and you will hear the difference. But like I mentioned before, this is something you have to get in the habit of doing with the way that you strum. You will really have to spend some time practicing it so that it becomes a part of your playing, so that everything will sound very nice and gentle. So the fifth thing that I want you to think about that can really affect the tone of your strum is how many strings do you strum when you strum a chord, okay? So take, for example, G major. And also take, for example, this very popular strumming pattern we have that goes down, down, up, down, up. Now, if you were to strum all 6 strings of the G, every time you strum for that strumming pattern, it will sound like this. And what we tend to hear is the highest note of whatever chord we're playing. So this note is the one that tends to stand out. So it sounds like this. Bram, bra, bram, bra, 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 bram, bra, bram, bra, bra, bram, right? Over and over and over. And if you do that for the entire song, it could really start to sound a bit annoying. So what you can think about is you can start to think about separating the strings within the chord as you strum. And a good way to start thinking about it is in terms of 3 groups. At least if we have chords that span 6 strings, at least 5 or 6 strings. So we can think of these strings, we can think of strings 6, 5, and 4 as the lower strings of the chord. Right? We can think of maybe 4, maybe 5, 4, 3, or even 4, 3, 2 as the middle strings. And then strings 3, 2, and 1 as the higher strings. So now we have 3 groups that we can play around with. So if you were to strum exclusively on the lower strings, for that G, we have this. And that sounds massively different than what we had. It still has that groove in it. It still has that rhythmic power in it. But it doesn't sound harsh. It sounds rather pleasant, actually. If you were to strum the top 3 strings over and over, something about that really stands out a bit, that kind of bam, bam, bam. And what I find is when we tend to strum higher strings, you really want to have the other things that I mentioned in this lesson, the things about how tight you grip the pick and whatnot, under control, because these higher strings really stand out if you have too much volume in it. Right? It really does stand out. If you strum the lower strings, it's a lot more forgiving in terms of the intensity of your strum. Okay? So that's really something to consider. A lot of strumming patterns generally always have a separation of low, middle, and high, at least low and high. It may not always be taught that you should strum the guitar in this way, but the song, if you were to listen to any song, these things are sort of implied, and it is your job as a guitarist or as a musician to interpret these sounds onto the guitar so that you can hear the dynamic of something that sounds low as opposed to something that sounds high, and when you should do it. Of course, learning to interpret this is sort of a journey, but at least consider the point of separating low and high strings in your playing, because like I said, hearing those high strings over and over could really just overtake everything else that you hear when you strum the guitar. So this is something to consider. Once again, something to practice and to think about until it becomes a very natural part of your playing. In terms of how to practice it, I suppose finding examples of strumming patterns where maybe the accents, or when I say accents, I mean when to strum low and when to strum high. If you could find examples of that to practice, that would kind of get you on the path to playing in that way. What I try to do, or something new I've started, is I'm putting out these strumming workout videos, or at least on Saturdays for now. I think what I'll do this Saturday is I'll try to put together a workout video that is catered to this lesson, maybe hitting on the main points of this lesson, things that you can do that will help you to get more of a balanced tone. So that should be a very good starting place for you to practice all of these ideas that you found in this lesson. So that's it for the lesson. I hope you enjoyed. Be sure to look out for the workout strumming videos that I started releasing once every week. Currently, I'm releasing them on Saturday morning, so you can look out for that this Saturday. I'm hoping that that one will reflect everything that we taught in this lesson here. And of course, if you enjoyed the lesson, please like, share, and subscribe, as it will help me to grow the channel. But until next time, goodbye.